Hello, I'm Greg Bala. I'm one of the co-founders of Trust Telescope. And what I'm going to show you here is some early results in our stakeholder analysis for the algorithm we're developing that and it analyzes the relationships between stakeholders and corporate or other entities and how they may interact and how the those interactions may materially impact the entity. So what we have is a system that analyzes a corpus of information about what may be happening between entities and stakeholders, like a company and environmentalists, or company and um, some competitors, or what may have you there, and and then produces a an analysis that shows how the stakeholders can work together to perhaps influence the entity. So the first thing we do is we take a corpus of information, such as a set of links to news items or pure text news items or legal documents or social media content, whatever it may be that describes the relationship or highlights some actions between stakeholders and entities and things of that nature. And from that, we then extract a timeline of epochs, which are themed areas of how the stakeholders may interact with the entity or entities over time with certain core themes. And then within those epochs, we're going to analyze how the stakeholders position themselves relative to issues and other behavioral aspects of their activity in a high dimensional space. And then from that information, derive clustering and inferred connections among them, given that they may have like interests. So this is an example of going through this particular scenario that involved ConocoPhillips on the Willow project in Alaska, and we went through and extracted a temporal epoch flow. It turned out that the algorithm, using natural language or using large language model processing, determined 4 epochs that are articulated here that were then used as inputs to other prompting to determine how the stakeholders that we will also find using a similar technique position themselves in those particular segments of time. And so here are our epochs again, and here are the stakeholders that this extracted algorithmically, and then consolidated those stakeholders given similarity of names or behavior and that kind of thing, again, using large language analysis. So we found over 100 raw stakeholders that were then consolidated into a much smaller number that we could then use in this analysis. And here, this is a summary of that kind of analysis here. And then what we do is we take the stakeholders we find and plot them in a high dimensional space consisting of activation characteristics such as these: competence, reliability, integrity, transparency, stakeholder care, value alignment, and so on. And there are over 20 of these. And then we also, in addition to that, analyze the set of issues that issues or areas of focus that these particular stakeholders may have in particular areas, such as climate change and specifically energy use, GHG emissions, that kind of thing. And there are upwards of 60 plus of these as well. So you get a dimensional space of over 80 coordinates or axes. And then we go through and use language analysis through the corpus and with the epic narratives to determine where they sit in that space. And what we end up with is this summary table of all of our stakeholders and where they sit in this analysis using actual numerical coordinates between 0 and 1, depending upon how much exposure or interest or just efficacy they have in a particular area in those 80 plus dimensions. From those dimensions, we can then, if we want to get a quick visual look at how they may cluster, we do a principal component reduction down to 3 dimensions and produce a plot in those 3 dimensions of where they sit, and we also highlight the dominant dimensions in that dimensional reduction. And so you get in the first epic sort of things are just starting out. You get a smattering of positions and so forth. And then this is from 2023 January through March, and things are just getting started. And then we move into the next epic, which is from March through April. Just a month long, but the things were hitting up there. The algorithm determined that was even though a short duration, a fairly significant epic. And we start to see some degree of clustering in these dimensions. And then we move to the third epic, which is from April through November of that year. And some of the stakeholder participants tail off because they might have had more mentions in the earlier news items, but the ones that remain tend to cluster more strongly because they're more vested into the situation. And by the way, on these stakeholders, in our little tool here, we can identify who they are and a description of what they're doing relative to this particular event or overall project that's being analyzed. And so that becomes a description of sorts of that stakeholder relative to the particular items in focus, which are then used in the language processing. So this one, for example, earth justice, and then we have biological diversity, and you get a feel for Greenpeace. They're kind of similar, as you may imagine, and they cluster together here in this area in the analysis here. Human rights, indigenous peoples, that kind of thing. And also environment. And then we move to the fourth one, which actually stretches over a longer duration all the way up to this current year, 2025. And so we have a few more stakeholders that have appeared because the duration is longer. And we also have some pretty coherent clusters that appear. And that's the clustering part. And then what the clusters do is they lend themselves to an implicit connectivity determination. So if items are close together, you can infer that maybe they aren't communicating with each other, but they are connected by like interests. And so from that geometric information in this space, we can then derive a connectivity matrix that would be useful in inferring who might be working together as a stakeholder relative to the entity who's interested in that kind of activity. And so this is a N by N matrix of the stakeholders and how they would connect to one another, where the green highlighted cells are indicate connection between the two. And so that's all done also just mathematically looking at the geometry that was generated from the earlier output. And that's the entire flow. This can be generally applied to to any kind of situation of this nature where you have stakeholders and entities. And we also, not shown here in this analysis, detect what are called the principals. In this case, we had one principal, which was ConocoPhillips, but you may have a situation where you have multiple principals, maybe multiple companies working in the same market or space, such as mining, for example. And you could do this analysis in a more general way and identify both stakeholders and principals, and also how they position themselves in the space relative to one another. And this algorithm is already tooled to do that. And that's the overall summary. And thanks for your attention, and hope you show further interest.